Please be seated.
Good morning. It is good to be with you this morning. I am glad to be home. Once again, it seems like I'm saying that way too often this summer, but it is true. We're gone this week to Jam Camp and came home. So this is Jam Camp. Now we're missing a couple of people. Catherine Colburn is not in here. She had to leave early to get back to school, but she was our lifeguard all week. Cassandra Martin is not in here, and she cooks for us all week, and she is just kind of camp mom. You'll be surprised how many kids just need a hug out at camp at times, and she's the one that does that for us. I don't know how this kid got in there, but he did. And so he came out to ride with cousins way home. But otherwise, everybody else was on camp all week long. And we had a great time, just a wonderful time. And so I've already got to start hearing some of the stories as they've gotten home and what they've done. Beginners Camp is a great introduction to camp life and a great introduction to that realm of spiritual growth. Incoming freshmen at places like ACU and Harding and some of those kinds of places generally in years past have taken a sort of a survey, an exam to ask them some questions. And one of the questions that they ask is, what was most fundamental in your development of your Christian life or your Christian walk? In camp always falls within the top 5. And so getting them started early, getting them in that routine, helping them to see Jesus in that way is an amazing time. And they are a lot of fun to be with. And so thank you for sending them with us. Thank you for allowing them to go. Go ahead and be planning for next year. It'll be another great time out at camp, and we hope to see your kids and your grandkids out there again. But we had a blast. If you're visiting with us, we want to say thanks for being here. We are glad that you're here. Believe that this is a place where you will meet Jesus and that you will have an opportunity to hear his call for you this morning. Want you to stick around for us after services. Let us shake your hand and meet you face to face. We're glad that you're here. We are eating together today, and that's an important time. That's a good time, and so we want you to stick around and eat with us. So much of what happens biblically happens around a table and folks eating together, and there is fellowship, and there is back and forth, and there is connection, and we want to share that with you this morning. If you are a member here, part of our family, stay. We're eating together as a family today, and we have folks that will be here with us, but stick around and be involved in that. We're going to go ahead and open our Bibles up to John chapter 11. We have been talking about rooted in this sermon series and what it means to be rooted. You remember that we started way back when talking about being rooted in who Jesus is, in the great I am. That Jesus identifies himself with God, identifies himself in that nature and that character and says, this is who I am, and I want you to know who I am. And in the book of John, John relates 7 instances in which Jesus says, I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the door of the sheep. I am the good shepherd. Jesus over and over draws pictures for us to say, I want you to know who I am. I want you to know how I function in the world. I want you to know how it is that I make a difference in the lives of people. And he invites us to anchor ourselves in his character, and he invites us to absorb what it is that he offers so that we can be Christ-like, so that we can look like Jesus. And so we walk through every week and talk about the picture and talk about the anchor and talk about what it is that Jesus calls us to absorb. And that's what we have been doing. And we are this morning going to talk about Jesus' next I am statement found in John chapter 11, verse 25, where Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life. And so I'm going to go ahead and invite you to open up, because the picture this morning is found in its entirety in John chapter 11. In John chapter 11. If we start in verse 1, it says this, Now a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay sick, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. Jesus has a relationship with Mary and Martha and with Lazarus, their brother. Jesus will preach in this area on an ongoing basis, and we find him at their house over and over again. It's almost as if he uses the home of Mary and Martha as sort of a base of operations for this stage in his ministry. He has come to love these three individuals. He has come to know these three individuals. They have become a part of his community. They've become a part of his relationships in this place. It's funny to think about Jesus at times because we always tend to hold Jesus a little bit aloof. We sort of imagine him walking along the road, and then the 12 apostles sort of follow behind 10 or 12 steps, right? Jesus is out in front, and the apostles are sort of behind, and then after that, there may be this group of people that are traveling with him, and then after that, there's about 5,000 or 6,000 people that follow, right? But Jesus is always sort of out front, walking by himself and walking, but that's not the picture that the Gospels draw for us. The pictures that the Gospels draw of Jesus are that Jesus is always in the middle of people's lives. That Jesus is always in the middle of whatever group is there. That Jesus doesn't walk ahead of the disciples, he walks with the disciples. And he teaches them how to be God's people. And he teaches them how to care for others. And he teaches them how to have vision and how to have direction. That when Jesus comes to visit a house, he sits with the host there and he talks, and there is this gathering that's around him, that Jesus is in the middle of this group, and that Jesus is present in this place in a very real, tangible way, that he wants to communicate, that he wants to relate, that he wants to connect with the people that are there. Not that he holds himself far off, not that he holds himself distant, but that he comes in and he invests himself in the people that he is meeting with, the people that he is talking to. And it is no different with Mary and with Martha and with Lazarus, that over time, Jesus has eaten in their home, Jesus has stayed in their home, Jesus has spent time talking to them, and has spent time investing in who they are. And it turns out that Lazarus now is sick. Verse 3, so the sister sent word to Jesus, Lord, the one you love is sick. And there's a sign of that investment, right? That the sisters know how Jesus feels about their family. The sisters know how Jesus would react to Lazarus being sick, and they want him to know that Lazarus is sick and that he is deathly ill. That it is important for Jesus to know because something could happen in this place. When he heard this, Jesus said, this sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it. And Jesus makes this prediction at the end of this whole thing, everything is going to be in a place where it points to the glory of God. Okay? Now, sometimes we want to key in on this whole thing where Jesus says, this sickness will not lead to death, and you and I know that Lazarus is going to. All right, so most of us know Lazarus is going to die, right? We haven't got there yet. We're going to get there. And we look at that and say, okay, Lazarus is going to die, but that's where the statement of Jesus, where he says, I am, gives us a promise, okay? That Jesus views death much differently than what I think you and I have become accustomed to thinking about when we think about death. Because Jesus chooses this picture, this time, to proclaim himself the resurrection and the life. We go on, we're going to jump down to verse 17, where it says, on his arrival, see, Jesus leaves the place where he was teaching and prepares to head back to Bethany, which is just outside Jerusalem. Now, the disciples say, Jesus, we can't go over there because last time we were there, those Jews tried to gather up and kill you. Okay, so maybe we shouldn't go. And Jesus says, no, we got to go see Lazarus. And they say, okay, we're going to go with you, even if it means we go to death. And so they begin to head towards Bethany. On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. And so, in this picture, Jesus chooses the death of a friend to reveal who he is, doesn't he? Now, at the death of a friend, there are some things that are going on here, right? Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, verse 18. Verse 19, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. And so they lose their brother, and as in any time of loss, there's a time of mourning, right? The friends have gathered around to weep with Mary and with Martha. They've come to comfort them. Verse 20, when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. And there's the picture that we look for, because it is a picture of darkness. Martha is in a place where she looks at Jesus and she said, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But right now, the reality that defines my family is the darkness of death. Right now, what defines my existence is the loss of someone that I love. Right now, what defines my existence is this just darkness is all we have to talk about, right? She lives in a place where it's hard to see. We deal with death that way. We deal with the death of a friend, with the death of a loved one, with the death of somebody that we have known, and we come to this place where we go, that's scary. And that's darkness, and that's grief, and there's a lot of things that go on in that place, and we sometimes question, and we sometimes wonder, and we sometimes fear what it is that's going to happen in this place, and we say that it's natural. And I believe that in a certain sense it is natural to fear what happens at death and to fear what goes on there. However, there is a truth that goes beyond that Jesus wants to bring into the picture. See, the world lives in a place where they say death is final, right? And most people go, well, that's true. I mean, is there anything more after dead? And not really, right? And we buy into that kind of thinking sometimes. That, but I believe there's something, I know, we believe but there's an end to this world, right? There's an end to this life, there's an end to this time. And in our minds, I think sometimes we reach a place where we go, death is really sort of the end. That death is sort of where it's final, and we fear that in some sense. And we fear that because we wonder what's going to happen after that. And Jesus tells us what's going to happen after that. And in that place, we get to experience something new. But the world will say, dead is dead and it's over. That we shouldn't worry about anything afterwards, that we should only worry in this life about what it is that we need to attain or what it is that we can accomplish or what it is that we can find. And we talk all the time about saying no to the world. And one of the things we have to say no to the world about is we have to say no to the world about the reality of death. Okay? Because dead is not the end. Do we know that? Do we know that? We ought to, right? That death is not the end. Death is a time for sorrow. Death is a time for grief. Death is a time to experience loss. Death can involve some fear. But death is not a time to give up hope. And death is not a time to give up faith. And death is not a time to give up, period. Right? That's the worldly thinking that's involved here. The picture that I want you to catch is that the world exists in a place of darkness, and we don't always like to think about it that way. We have good neighbors who are good people who have no relationship with God. And we look at them and say, I cannot view them as being dark. And the problem is that if folks don't know Jesus, if folks don't walk with the Lord, then they live in the world and they live in darkness. And it's a terrible thing. It's a terrible thing. The picture that Jesus draws here is the picture of a finality that happens if we are not in a relationship with Jesus. The great thing about this is that Jesus chooses this point in time to reveal something that is amazing, something that is incredible, something that should just send us over the top, joyful in our lives, because Jesus chooses this point in time to look at Martha and say, verse 22, but I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. Verse 23, Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Jesus makes a promise here. Verse 24, Martha answered, I know he will rise at the resurrection at the last day. And Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. Jesus makes this proclamation that I have control over what is dead. I have control over what has died. I have control over what everybody else says is the end. What the world tells you and what the world believes is not the defining standard of reality. Okay? It is amazing to me over and over and over again that we look at the world and what the world has to say and say, well, this is the reality we live in. Well, you know what? That is untrue. The world will never be able to define reality because the world doesn't know what's real. Jesus knows what's real. Only Jesus can define reality. Only Jesus can define what it is that we believe. Only Jesus can define what it is that we trust in. Only Jesus can define what it is that we hope in. Martha says, oh, Jesus, he is dead. I know that whatever you ask, God will give you. Jesus says, you know, he'll rise. And Martha goes, sure, he'll rise in the last day. He'll rise at the end. Everything will be okay once we get there in the end because dead is dead and dead is final. And Lazarus has died. And so what we're going to do is we're going to make a justification for God and for God's work and explain that that'll all happen later on. And that's a big, long Greek word for that. It's called baloney. It's what it is. If we think that God only works in the future and doesn't work in the now, we have it wrong. The reality is that God works today. The reality is that God is active in our lives today. The reality is that Jesus is the resurrection today, and that he is the life today. And then when Jesus looks at Martha and says, Lazarus will rise, there ought to be within her something that goes, woohoo! That's the greatest news that I have heard. But the reality is she hears a promise of God and she goes, someday. How often do we do that? How often do we hear what it is that God promises and say, someday? Rather than to jump up and down and go, woohoo, today is the day God has promised. Today is the day that God is at work. Today is the day that God is active. Today is the day that God is on the move. Today is the day that Jesus is the resurrection and life. That's what he proclaims there to Martha. Verse 25, he who believes in me will live even though he dies, and whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? And it is this place that Jesus begins to give us a series of anchor points. And the first one is found right there in verse 25, where Jesus offers himself as our anchor. Where Jesus offers his presence in our lives as his anchor. Where Jesus offers to stand in whatever it is that we're standing in and say, I will provide stability and I will provide reality and I will provide direction for you. Though you walk in a world of darkness, I will stand in that world as a light that shines out for you. Will you draw close to me? For Martha, the question there for Jesus is, the question there from Jesus is, I'm here. Are you ready? I'm here. Let's go see. I am here. Do you believe? Martha says, I believe. I know who you are. I know that he'll rise at the last day. Verse 27, yes, Lord, she told him, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who has come into the world. And after she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. The teacher is here, she said, and is asking for you. When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who had been with Mary in the house comforting her noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to mourn there. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, Lord, if you had not been here, my brother would not have died. Sisters to the end, aren't they? Both in the same place. Both have the same statement. If you had been here, he would not have died. It's an amazing statement to know Jesus, to know the Lord, and to think that there are times when he leaves us, and times that he's far off, and times that he's not present. Because that's not what it is that Jesus offers us, is it? See, when Jesus offers himself, Jesus offers his love. He is connected to Lazarus. Mary ought to know that, right? Here's the one who came and said, I'm going to prepare you. I've come to weep over your feet. I've come to mourn for you. I've come to... She knows who Jesus is. She loves the Lord. Jesus loves her. She comes at a time of grief, and she says, if you had been here, he would not have died. Verse 33, Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping. He was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Where have you laid him, he asked. Come and see, Lord, they replied. And Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, see how he loved him. Jesus is not afraid to show his love, is he? Jesus is not afraid to stand up and say, I love you. Jesus is not afraid to stand up and express who he is, to express what it is that he's all about, to look at you and say, you are worth more than you think. You are important. You belong with me. I love you. Jesus comes to the tomb of a friend, and does Jesus know what's going to happen? Absolutely. He's already told him, right? Lazarus will rise again, right? Jesus told him way back when he got the news of the first time, this is not going to end in death, this ends in life. This is one of those times when God is going to be glorified. This is a big time coming, man. And yet Jesus comes to the tomb of a friend, and what does he do? He weeps. He cries. He expresses the way that his heart feels. It's not a show. It's not an illustration for future generations. This is the Lord who loves us. This is a God who grieves over sin. Because this is not our natural state. You and I were not created to die. I don't know if we ever understand that. Why is it scary? Why do we fear it? Because we were not created to die. We were created to live with God forever. Sin brought about death. Sin brought about destruction. Sin brought about an alteration to what it is that you and I were created for, and that is life with God. Why can the world not define that? Because the world doesn't understand it. The world wants to say that it's inevitable, right? Two things that are going to happen: death and taxes. The world will say it. Can't stop it. Can't control it. Can't do anything about it. But Jesus says that's not true. Jesus says Lazarus will rise because I love him. Because I have given myself for him. Because all that I have and all that I am, I will give for you. Verse 37, some of them said, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying? And Jesus looks at them and says, oh, yes, I could have. Because Jesus is going to offer his power in this place. Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with the stone laid across the entrance. Take away the stone, he said. But Lord, said Martha, the sister of the dead man, by this time there is a bad odor, for he has been there 4 days. I've told you this before, I'll tell you again. King James Version, right? Lord, he stinketh. Right? And there is truth there. The dead stink. Sin stinks. And we need somebody to call us from that place, don't we? To call us out of the world and to call us out of darkness. Verse 40, Jesus said, did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God? So they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me. But I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me. Now, I love that passage because that's where Jesus says, this is for you, right? He looks at me and goes, God, I know what's going to happen, and I appreciate it. I say this because I want everybody else to know what's going to happen. I want everybody else to know exactly where this is supposed to point. See, Jesus embarks on a series of things that man looks at and says, this is weird. This is foolish. This is not normal. You don't go to the tomb of a man who's been buried for 4 days and open it because he stinks, right? You don't go to God and offer a prayer of thanksgiving when somebody is dead, right? But that's exactly what Jesus does. Jesus stands in the face of what everybody thinks ought to happen. He does something different. Verse 43, when he said this, Jesus called out in a loud voice, Lazarus, come out! The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, take off the grave clothes and let him go. here is the power of God. Here's what it is that God wants to do. Here's what it is that God wants to offer the entire world, and that is his power to be the resurrection and life, to bring those that are dead back in the land of living. As Jesus calls us to anchor ourselves in his presence and in his love and in his power, he says, there are things that I want you to experience. Can you imagine for just a moment the reaction of the people that are there? Some will believe and put their trust in him, the passage says. Some go back to report to the other folks, and the Sanhedrin all gets together, and they meet, and they talk about the fact that it's time for this man to die, right? But Jesus says, if you'll choose to live in me, there are some things that you can absorb in this situation. One, you can absorb the presence of Jesus. You and I never walk alone. You and I never go to the movies alone. You and I never enter a relationship without somebody who's already there. You and I are constantly in the presence of Jesus. When Jesus offers himself to us in that way, you and I have to be deliberate about absorbing that. We go to camp, to jam camp, and one of the things that I love about jam camp is we take a group of teenagers as counselors. And every night we get together and we say, we want to know what the best thing that happened all day is. And I want to know what the hardest thing that happened all day is. And they have to answer every day. And all of them have to answer. And at the end of the week, we talk about what that's all about. And we talk about seeing how it is that God is on the move. And how it is that God is present. And what it is that Jesus is doing. To absorb the presence of Jesus, you and I need to practice. We need to stay in this place and we need to call upon a Jesus who says, I will come. Who says, I'm already there. Who says, I will never leave you or forsake you. But we need to practice the presence of Jesus to understand that he is always close. Jesus says, I want you to absorb the faithfulness of Jesus. That Jesus is a person who keeps his promises. When Jesus says that Lazarus will rise, what can we count on? The fact that at the end of the story, Lazarus is coming out of that tomb. Whether it makes sense to you and me or not, whether we can understand how it works or not, what we know is that God has the power to move folks from dead to alive. And that when God promises, God is faithful to his promise. What has Jesus promised you? Has he promised you that you would die to the world? Absolutely. Has he promised that you would walk in newness of life? Absolutely. Has he promised you grace and peace and hope and yes and yes and yes? And do we absorb that? Do we soak that up? Do we think about that every day? Do we write little notes on the mirror? Do we tell ourselves when we get in the car, when we get up in the morning, when we lay down at night, when we walk along with our children, are we absorbing what it is that God has promised us? Are we laying a hold of what it is that God has promised us? Or are we hanging on to guilt and hanging on to shame and hanging on to anger and hanging on to hurt? Or are we allowing God in his faithfulness, who has promised to deal with those things, are we allowing him to deal with them? Jesus says, I want you to absorb the joy of Jesus. Lazarus comes out of that tomb, and I can only imagine Mary and Martha must go wild with excitement. The dead have come back to life. And that's a joy that Jesus wants us to feel. That Jesus wants us to walk in this world and say, we are alive. We are part of the family of God. We walk in this place in the presence of Jesus, by the power of Jesus, with the promise of Jesus. And there's nothing that can stop our joy. Nothing that can stop who we are. You and I need to learn to practice absorbing what it is that Jesus is. Learn to understand that we live in life. That God has brought us back from the dead. That God has changed where we're at. We are not defined by the world. We are defined only by resurrection. There is nothing more central to the Christian belief than the cross. For God so loved the world, right? That he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever would believe in him should not perish but have everlasting life. That we live in that place where the cross is fundamental because it shows us the love of God. It calls us to belief. It calls us to live in resurrection power. It calls us to live as a body in this world that proclaims that Jesus is Lord. And I want us to practice that this week. Here's the discipleship challenge. Are you ready? All right, see, I asked that question and only a few people answer. Are you ready? All right, I want you to get ready. All right? I want you to be all in, okay? Part of living resurrection life is reminding each other that resurrection is active, okay? That we are alive. Martha runs out to meet Jesus. Jesus, if you had been here, my brother, Jesus explains that. She runs back home. Mary runs out and says, Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have. And Jesus explains that. Jesus brings Lazarus from the dead, and I just cannot help but think about what Mary and Martha do after that. Every day that they get up and Lazarus shows up at the breakfast table, what do they say? You know, this was easier when you were dead. You didn't mess up the floor like that. Right? No. They look at Lazarus and say, we are so glad to have you back. We are so glad to share in the joy of resurrection. We need to share in the joy of resurrection. So here's what I want you to do. You ready? Say you're not ready. Say, are you ready? All right. You're always ready. I want you to send a card to someone this week with a very specific purpose, okay? I want you to send a card to someone this week who needs encouragement, who needs to experience the joy of knowing that Jesus is present and that he is faithful. You ready? Will you do that with me? Will you send a card this week? Will you be encouraging? You specifically remind somebody that Jesus is present and that Jesus is faithful, that Jesus is moving. That's the challenge. God says, you are mine and I am yours. I want you to be a part of this. I want you to be a part of this family. I want you to be a part of this body. I want you to be a part of what it is that's going on. And so God stands in a place where every time we get together, he says, come to me. Come be a part of something great. Come experience life and resurrection. Leave behind death and the world. Come and follow me. We want to extend that invitation this morning. If you need to follow Jesus more closely, whether it be through baptism or repentance, prayers of the church, whatever it may be, we ask you to come forward right now as we stand and as we sing.